Pleased to welcome Thom Kenrick, who's Head of Community Programmes at the Royal Bank of Scotland. Thank you very much, Thom.
Thank you.
It's your turn to be in the hot seat.
Excellent, I think. It's like mastermind more than a fireside chat. It's like, what's
know,
your specialist
yes.
subject? I'm not sure.
Harry Potter. Yes, banking. Okay, question number one then.
Okay.
So I mentioned earlier, obviously there has been one of the push factors for change in finance was the global financial crisis of a decade ago. So in your view, how has banking changed in response to the crisis over the last 10 years? And also how is it changing in response to emerging pressures around sustainability, around the environment as well?
Yeah, okay, well, thanks, Gail. It's quite a big question to start with. So, I mean, I can obviously talk about it primarily from RBS's perspective, but, I mean, RBS was obviously very firmly in the eye of the storm around the global financial crisis, and certainly in the UK, one of the kind of big names. And I think, I mean, our own journey, because I've been with the bank for 14 years now, our own journey over that 10 and a bit years has really been one about reform and restructure. But in terms of what did it do for the banking sector, it did a couple of things on that are very relevant to this topic. One is obviously just a massive change in the way regulators and governments looked at, and investors in fact, but the way the outside world really looked at us and applied scrutiny. And I think there was certainly a period of time when it was felt that bankers know best, or they're doing awfully well, let's see where we go with this, and that obviously didn't work out too well, as a result, that kind of external pressure has really come back to bear, and there have obviously been enormous changes in the regulation and in how banks are, and in RBS's case, our ownership, because we're owned by the UK government, and the scrutiny that has brought as well, both directly from our ownership structure, but then also people's expectation, because we're government owned, has been very, very different. At the same time, I think it really emboldened, so the second thing is then it kind of emboldened outside groups to feel like they had a better chance of having a say and having a stake in it, and it drove increased kind of dialogue and transparency and stakeholder engagement, not just for RBS, but I see it across lots and lots of banks where in the same way as I was saying previously, I think regulators and governments probably thought, well, we'll see how they go. They seem to be doing awfully well. The bankers believed that as well, and when they were criticised, it was like, well, we seem to be doing a pretty good job actually. So I think you'll find we'll just carry on. And that evaporated completely very, very quickly after 2008-9. We were, and in fact, Andrew headed up the team at RBS for a period of time as well. And you're straight into very direct engagement with anyone and everyone to try and really listen and learn and to change that attitude, and to use the sort of transparency and the dialogue as a way of really trying to improve things. So those kind of two were the big things. And then, as I say, in terms of what we were actually doing to the organisation, the reform and the restructure, some of which was mandated, some of which was just necessary, and some of which was just, to make the bank a better bank. All of those things were going on at the same time, and so you had that combination of internal and external forces that just completely fundamentally changed the bank. And it is a very, very different place today than it was 10 years ago.
And that's great to hear. And where do you think there have been really good progress in making some of those changes and improvements as they relate to culture, transparency, or others? And where do you think there is still some way to go, perhaps?
So I think a lot of the focus, to be frank, was not on necessarily what we would necessarily call the E and the S issues. Most of them were probably on the G, and also they were really on the kind of the restructure and the financials and the risk and getting everything from a banking perspective much more safe, secure and stable and simple. And so there have been long swathes of time working in the central sustainability team where actually we've had quite a lot of elbow room because everyone's been off fixing the kind of the fundamentals, and this stuff has maybe sometimes been seen as a sort of parallel or external thing, but that actually served really nicely at times because it allowed us to kind of just position things and get on with stuff out of the limelight, because when you're dealing with things like PPI, the whole controversy around our restructuring unit and how that had been treating, then you've got LIBOR, that's retail, commercial and investment banking, each with their own spectacular, and RBS involved in all three of them. Strangely, pressure groups kind of jumping up and down saying you should be reducing your exposure to coal didn't factor large round the board table necessarily, but it was something that we could engage the executive with, and we could engage the teams that were involved and the risk teams, and we could work away as a group of teams that were interested in this and understood the issues to really progress that. So actually that meant that quite a lot happened in a relatively easier way almost than it might have been if it had been the top of the agenda, because we were able to make those decisions and get on with stuff because there was very much the right, no, we're dealing with this huge stuff, so you sort that out, and that helped us move things on quite a long way, and I'd be lying as well to say that changing from a truly global bank with all the different lines of business that we had to a primarily UK-centric retail and commercial bank has also made this a much easier thing, because it's easier to look at a lot of these issues when you're looking at sort of the UK or Western European economies than when you're really trying to think about how do you bring these things to bear in some other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned, Tom, that there's been a lot of focus in RBS on the G out of the ESG. So perhaps to focus on the E and the S part, this year in New York we saw, for example, the launch of the UN's Principles for Responsible Banking. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen the quite substantial growth in sustainability-themed bonds, in particular green bonds and other initiatives. What do some of these international initiatives and trends that we're seeing in the current market, what do they mean for RBS, if anything, and how are they impacting the way you do business?
So I think they are increasingly important, and partly because our investors are asking us and our customers are asking about them in a way that they weren't even 3 years ago, and so that obviously changes things quite a lot. It's always interesting kind of coming after it at the asset management side, because thinking about the kind of asset management questionnaires, we fill in so many of those now. I think we try and minimise them, and there's basically about 12 that we have to do every year. It's a full-time job for a team just to fill in those questionnaires, but they if you just don't collect the data for one of them, then you get no score, and then that marks you down, and so you end up with this weird situation where you can score really, really well in some of them and really badly in others, whereas if you look at ratings agencies, there's a much more consistency between them. So totally agree with the view that Andrew was putting forward, that at the moment that kind of inconsistency in the kind of early stage and lack of agreement. But what we are seeing with these international agreements like the Principles of Responsible Banking is that, and things like TCFD, is that there is an increasingly clear set of not rules yet, but a clear set of principles and ideas about what good looks like. And that's making it much, much easier now for us to pull the levers and at the same time our bosses are watching the same TV programmes and hearing the same thing and reading the same stuff in the media as everyone else is. And so the combination of them catching up and this stuff means it is much easier now for us to kind of say, right, well, we have to do X, Y, Z, and we need to get on with it, and putting that stuff on the top table, as well as the stuff that we were able to organise ourselves. I think the other thing with stuff like PRB and TCFD is that there's been things around for years, and Andrew mentioned the PRI. It's got, I think, 2,000 signatories, but some tiny proportion of them actually do even the top three things that it says in the PRI that you have to do. And you can be a member of the Equator Principles and the Global Compact and all of these different things. And for a long time, those have almost been the kind of like, oh, well, we'll sign up to these things and put the logos on our website because that'll do us good. And that time is over, I would say. And certainly speaking, from a bank, because the NGOs, the investors, the customers are now saying, right, so you've signed up to that, what have you done? And what was quite interesting with the principles of responsible banking is that they haven't just kind of laid out the principles, but they are being more prescriptive about the process in the way the PRI haven't been. And they are saying if you're not where you should be in 2 years, 4 years, you will get kicked out. And those are the sorts of things that really change people's mindsets, because this isn't like we're not doing this because it's a badge of honor or a logo we can put on a website. We're doing this because we see the industry has to change, and this is the way it's going to change.
And I think that what we've seen is there really is increased scrutiny, of some of the these are international initiatives, but ultimately they're voluntary initiatives. But there's always a risk that it's the converted that sign up to them, the better performers. But I think they're now, as interest is increasing and there's more and more banks or investors that are signing up to these initiatives, actually making sure that they are meaningful and credible, I think is an issue that is going to have increasing attention over the coming years.
Yeah, and there's a difference between voluntary, it makes you look good, and voluntary, if you don't do it, it's going to cost you a lot more to borrow, and you're going to have a lot more regulatory scrutiny, and your profit's going to be lower, and you're going to find it harder to find investors. That's a lot less voluntary than the kind of voluntary that we had 3 years ago. So, some of these things now, you're asked in the questionnaires, what are you signed up to and what have you done to achieve to actually meet the criteria? And so if you're not signed up, it's voluntary, but that's going to have an impact.
Yeah. Okay, so Tom, looking ahead.
Yeah.
So next year is a big year for Scotland as it hosts the UN Climate Conference. This year's conference in Madrid, COP25, I think many were left disappointed with the outcome. But nevertheless, one bright spot was certainly the EU's presentation of its Green New Deal plan. So my question, which has quite important ambitions in there to transform Europe's economy, decarbonise Europe's economy by 2050. And I think Scotland has actually been even more ambitious in its decarbonisation targets for 2045. Of course, the proof is always in the pudding of these. But from a banking point of view, how do you think UK and European banks should respond to the urgent need to transition to a low-carbon economic model, and ensure that they are able to offer the products and services that will enable that low-carbon transformation to happen in ways that are just and inclusive, of course, which is very important because they do involve quite fundamental economic transformations. And of course, doing so could also place certain banks could give them a more competitive edge, of course.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that was a big announcement at the weekend?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, just taking, and it's so much more than just the climate finance, obviously, but just taking the kind of low carbon transition as an example, RBS has gone from one of the biggest fossil fuel banks in the world. We actually owned the URL, the oil and gas bank, to one that is now considered amongst the UK banks to have some of the best policies. We've been the leading lender to UK renewables now in terms of deal number for 10 years. And so it's a combination, just thinking about the energy sector, because back to Nick's point, it's more than just the energy sector. But thinking about the energy sector, it's the combination of both reducing exposure and changing policies and the gradual tightening of the fossil fuel exposure, and then at the same time doing everything you can to just ramp up the low carbon alternatives and get in there as early as you can and deploy as much capital as you can. And you're almost seeing a bit of a race who can announce the biggest number, even if it has the longest deadline on it, to be able to talk about that. But I think up to this point, a lot of it has been constrained by the bank still serves today's real economy. And in fact, if you look at the book, not the new deals each year, but if you look at our balance sheet, it's actually serving the economy from 3 or 5 or 10 years ago, because that's when the deals were written. And so the embedded carbon in the back book is greater. So there is an ever increasing acceleration to do that. And what things like the EU Green Deal will do, and the UK government's announcements about carbon neutral by 2050 and the phasing out of diesel and electric cars, for example, is those give us much clearer future orientation around specific points where we can aim for to say, right, by then we know. So it's things like that, and we've done a lot of work with some of the things like, especially around revolving credit facilities, about putting a ratchet on the margin, so that as companies' sustainability performance improves, that makes their cost of funding cheaper. And we've done deals which you work out, you can, especially around efficiency, energy efficiency, and this is across all sectors, where you work it out and they actually pretty much pay for the finance that they're taking through the efficiency improvements that work gives them. And so there's all those sorts of, and there'll be loads more that we haven't even thought of yet as this stuff speeds up. And having those very clear frameworks and those very clear deadlines allows the risk teams and the deal teams to be more, not aggressive, but more confident about the future direction, and that allows us to do more business.
Yep. No, certainly some exciting opportunities ahead, I think. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask if there's any burning questions for Tom before perhaps inviting Andrew back up to join us for a general discussion. Anything Tom has said that anyone particularly wants to respond to? Comment on? Christine.
Hi,
thank you.
Prof. Christine Bamford, Women's College, I think we've chatted before. I was really interested, and it's a more narrow question, I guess, about your social strategy and the interest I have in financial inclusion. And is there elements within your social strategy that looks at that in particular?
Yes.
Can you share?
I mean, I actually lead. I don't lead on the environment side. I lead on the social side. And what Andrew said about social being a bit of a nightmare, because I mean, not just about the range of issues, but also because of the divergence of views. So, like, stand-up arguments about how restrictive our policy around the defence sector should be. Between different members of the team, and so even when you can agree what issues you'd be talking about, people have wildly diverging views about what the right answer is. But then at the same time, you're beginning to see people take social. The Norwegian pension funds divested on human rights grounds. They announced, some companies, they were coming out of So you're now seeing, there's divestment on social stuff, but we haven't agreed what the list of issues is yet.
Yes.
And back to those 13 questionnaires, they each ask us about different, well, not each, but there is not consistency between all of those questionnaires about what they ask for. So social is just like a handful at the moment, but it's really exciting because 1 minute I'm talking about nuclear power, the next minute I'm talking about adult entertainment, the next minute I'm talking about financial inclusion, and it's just like, it's very sporty. On financial inclusion, I mean, so there's a whole range of issues around financial inclusion. There's obviously basic access to services, there's access to infrastructure, there's access to credit.
Yes.
And so we've got, a range of different approaches that are dealing with the different issues at the different points and with the different audiences that they affect. One of the things that we've been looking at recently around inclusion and just access to services is audiences who do not traditionally or easily use digital channels, because obviously we want to get the majority of people onto digital, and the majority of customers say they want to be on digital because of the convenience and the access that gives them. But there are some audiences that doesn't work for, so we've been running workshops with charities and with people who are maybe struggling with that, whether that's elderly people with certain specific needs, and trying to work through those sorts of things. So I can't give you it's this answer because it depends on which part of the inclusion agenda we're talking about. But I'm obviously happy to chat in more detail.
It's really interesting for us to have a dialogue, but I'm glad it's on there. But I agree with you, it is a huge issue which has lots of tensions.
It does.
Thanks, Christine.